Hi, everyone. Um, Welcome, and I am glad to be here today with you. I am trying. Give me 1 minute. Okay, sorry. We just tested everything, but of course, when you try and do it, it doesn't work the same way. There we go. Okay. So I am representing the Telly program here. Telly stands for Tools for Engaging Landowners Effectively. The program was started in 2008 and was an initiative of the Sustaining Family Forests Initiative, which is a partnership of the Forest Service, the Family Forest Research Center, and Center for Nonprofit Strategies, which is my organization. We work with a variety of nonprofits, helping them with program strategies, organizational strategies, as well as marketing and fundraising strategies. And then the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. And as Amanda said, the program is in the process of moving over to the Family Forest Research Center, which is housed at UMass at Amherst. So we are in the middle of our own transition over here. The Telly program is it's an approach. It's an approach to communicating with landowners and planning your outreach programs. And I'm going to talk to you about that approach today and then see how that applies to oak resiliency and your conversations with landowners about oak. What goes into this? We started with landowner research. That was sort of the heart of the Telly program. And then we brought in the ideas and tools and techniques that emerge from a science, a whole field and a whole literature called social marketing. And then we sort of said, oh, well, while we're talking literature, let's look at other literature also. And then that incorporated a whole lot of other behavioral science literature that has to do with how people make decisions, how they work in groups, how they understand material, how social factors play into whether or not people take action. So there's a whole lot of science behind what makes people take certain actions or what guides their decisions. And we've tried to sort of wrap all of that up into the Telly approach. And then we have the practical experience over the last, I guess, 12 years of Telly. We've worked on more than 50 projects across the country. And so our hope and our effort is that with every project, the Telly program gets a little bit better because we adapt and we learn and whatever we learn from the projects, we try and bring into this program. So what does Telly do? We do a whole lot of trainings, which is basically teaching people how to use the Telly approach. We do project support. We work with individual projects and we help them with planning the program and implementing their outreach and evaluating it. We do specialized workshops for organizations. So for example, we've done one for the Great Plains Initiative, just bringing that team together to work on that project and training them, but also helping them with implementation. And then there's a whole lot of tools and resources that are available on our website, which I would encourage you to check out. And also that listserv that Amanda mentioned. After you've been through this webinar, we call it joining the Telly family. You become part of our family, and then we at least try to maintain contact with you. We send you a newsletter, which has a couple of tips. It only goes out 3 or 4 times a year. You can always subscribe, but we would like that you would continue to work with us. So what we're going to do today is I'm going to take about the first 15-20 minutes to introduce you to the Telly principles. And then we will work with Christopher and Amanda and I together. We will work with you to try and use these principles to generate ideas for how you would talk to landowners about oak resiliency. So that's the practical part of this. And we are expecting you to type furiously into the chat box so that we have your responses and it can be more of an open discussion about using these principles. What does that tell us? What does that tell us we can say to landowners? Okay, so here are the Telly principles. The very first one is about action. And this is how I think the Telly approach is very different than traditional educational approaches. In those approaches, what you try and say is you focus on what you want landowners to know or what you want them to think. And when we are, and the assumption here is that if only we get them to understand the issue the way we understand the issue, then they will take the right action. What behavioral science tells us is that's not the case. The connection or the correlation between action and knowledge is not always a very well-founded correlation. So it doesn't play out that way. And so we say, well, let's be direct. Let's talk about exactly what you want landowners to do. Be very clear about what you want landowners to do, and then think about what is it going to take to get them to do that action. The other part of this is that what is a simple action to you, like maybe manage for oak, or conduct a prescribed burn, or do thinning, or do continuous active management, whatever that might be. That is actually not a single action for landowners. It's actually a series of actions. And we encourage you to break that down, break that entire process of taking the landowner from being a complete naive novice landowner who's never thought of it before, all the way to taking action. Oftentimes what you do is you start at the bottom and you stop at the bottom. You do an introductory meeting, and then you don't think about what follow-up is needed. So we are really encouraging you to, the Telly program is about figuring out who's going to be at what step and how you can move them along. Very easily, what this means for you is, one thing is that when you talk to a landowner, don't overwhelm them with information. Don't give them information from step 1 through step 4. So saying, here's the benefits of oak, managing your forest for oak. Here are all the things that you have to do, and here's some information on the different management practices, and here's the information on the cost share that you're going to have to do to be able to do those, and here's a list of the loggers that you can use, right? We tend to overwhelm landowners if we give them all the information at once. So the idea is, like, just give them enough information, be very clear about what the next step is for this landowner in your conversation, and give them just enough information and give them all the support that they need to get from step 1 to step 2. The other insight for you guys is that you don't have to always start at step 1. So again, our approach is always to bring more landowners into the fold. Let's reach more landowners. Let's reach different landowners. Oftentimes, if you're thinking of landscape level impact, you might want to work with the people who are already in your system, depending on your goals. Sometimes you do need widespread goals, but for some things, like we did a project about seed trees, having a very few seed trees left I think it was for aspen. At that point, they just needed very few landowners to do a treatment. And if you're just going to do that, you may want to start with the people who are already doing a lot, who are already oriented, and you can take them just the next step. So thinking about where the blocks are and thinking about how you want to move landowners to the next step is very important for us. The second principle is about tailoring the program to a specific audience. And this is sometimes feels counterintuitive for you when you are doing broad scale outreach. Like when you're developing brochures, you want to you don't know who's going to see that brochure. So you want to write everything that you know down, hoping that the person is going to find what they are most interested in. That is, of course, a problem. But the other problem is here, most of us are able to tailor our messages really well when we're talking to one landowner, right? You're able to figure out, if you've been doing forestry, you've been doing landowner outreach. Most foresters that I know are very good at talking to the individual and figuring out what's going to motivate them, getting their plans, and then tailoring the messaging and the program to them. So that's not a problem. The problem often is the offering itself. So oftentimes we have the sort of the same program offering for different landowners. We have this idea that everybody should come to a webinar, or sorry, you don't do webinars that much. Everybody should come to a workshop. Everybody who's interested in fish should come to a workshop, or everybody should go to this course, a landowner, how to be a good steward course, or everybody should come to a walk in the woods. And understanding here is that different landowners are going to have different steps that are doable for them. Some are going to be more strapped for time. Some are going to be more strapped for money. Some are going to be more passionate. Some are going to be less passionate. And you really have to be able to provide different ways for them to engage with you. Some will want to do it in person, some are going to want to do it online. So find what's going to work, find the ways for a landowner to engage with you. And also they're going to need different levels of support. Some people are going to need more knowledge and information, and some I don't want the knowledge. They're going to be like, I don't care, just find me a logger or find me the right forester and let them do the knowledge part. I don't need to know this. So that's another part of getting a read on your landowner. We don't have to educate them. We don't have to teach them the right way to do this. We just need to get them to do it. Okay. Let me show you. So what we're going to do is, what I'd like you to do is to write some down through the chat box. Please write some of the audiences that you work with. So think of the kinds of landowners. Can you find types of landowners that you work with who sometimes have different responses, right? So it could be farmers are different than other landowners that I work with, or older landowners are different than other landowners that I work with, or, you know, whatever. Think about the kinds, think in your head of the different types of landowners that you work with and write some of them down in the chat box. We'll pause after the next 2 slides and we'll just go over what you wrote. What I'd like to do in the next few minutes is to illustrate how this tailoring idea works out when you're designing programs. So here's an example. This is not applicable to you guys. It's from the South. It's about prescribed burns for improving longleaf pine. And the graphic is a little bit confusing here, but that's just to make sure that you guys are not sleeping through this. It's the different trees on this graphic actually represent different kinds of landowners. So different landowners are going to have different barriers to why they won't want to take you up on your offer to burn their woods, right? So some of them might be thinking, hey, I really am sold on this idea. I want to burn. I think I realize it's a good thing, but I don't have the skills and I don't have the tools. And so this looks like, and I can't find a contractor. This looks really complicated right now. So yes, it's a good idea. I would love to do it, but they can't translate that intention into action because they don't have the resources to do it. Okay. There might be other types who are on the other end of the spectrum and they're like, why would I ever want to do this? It sounds like a terrible idea. I'm just hurting all the wildlife. My woods look perfect just the way they are. This seems like one of those things where they don't know what they're telling. I don't believe that this is good. Okay. And then you might have some other people in the middle who are like, yeah, it might be a good idea, but I can't burn my land. Let's think about the cost. And I don't know how to, think about the liability. Like they see like positive, like real barriers to the idea itself. Now, if you have one meeting on prescribed burns or one workshop on prescribed burns, and you're hoping to bring all these people in and to give all of them information that they need, that's what it's going to be. It's going to be information. It's not going to be motivating and compelling. And we'll talk about that in a few minutes for any one of these. So it's almost like you have to push enough to get landowners over a threshold of action. And if you dilute your efforts, you're not able to push anybody over that threshold. So instead, what you might want to do is something like this. So you group people and you say, okay, there are some people who want to burn but don't have the skills. What would be the right offering for these people? And possibly the right offering is a learn and burn workshop with members of a prescribed burn association with the option to join that association. So their main barrier is eliminated, right? They have access to the skills and the tools, and they can work and they can learn what they need to do to be able to do this. The people who are concerned about cost and liability, you might want to give them a brochure or give them additional information about you might want to give them enough information about the technical assistance that's available to them or the financial assistance that's available to them. And similarly, the people who are on the other end of it, who don't even know why this is useful, you might want to have a more educational meeting with them about how the forest health can be improved by burns and the benefits of burning and so on. So the point is these three people need different things, and landowners are able to give you only very limited attention. And if you try to do everything in the time that you have, you'll end up losing them and overwhelming them. So this is where the targeted marketing and the tailored offer is really important, because you really want to figure out what you want, what that landowner needs at that point in their journey, and give them just that information or just that support or just that motivation. Okay, so that's how targeted marketing works. So I'm going to turn it over to Amanda to talk a little bit and tell us what kinds of audiences people typed in.
Yeah, thank you, Purnima. This is great. So we've had some really good thoughts coming into the chat box as you've been describing different audiences within kind of a targeted marketing approach. So what are some of the audiences you typically work with? We've heard land trust members, farmers, small private forest owners, multi-generational ranchers, women farmers, women absentee landowners. In Rhode Island, a mix of new property owners getting into the current use program and a core of longtime tree farmers, et cetera. There's also audiences of agriculture teachers, elementary and secondary science teachers, long time, like 100 to 200 years, generational owners, very locally oriented, lots of land, but not much money. More small private forest owners, municipalities is another. Other land trusts, Boy Scout camps, town-owned properties, so a little bit more public use. Family forest landowners, small landowners who are interested in amenity values, beauty, recreation, hunting, walking, hiking, etc. So you can hear quite a variety here, and hopefully folks, you can see from Purnima's graphic that you might want to consider taking a more targeted approach to reach those different audiences in your outreach.
The same materials won't work. It might be very small. I mean, I'm not suggesting that, you know, every single time you go meet someone, you develop a new brochure. That's not what we're saying. But it might be helpful to think about the 2 or 3 main target groups that you have and develop and customize your material somewhat with thinking about what these people need to hear from me. What are their questions? And that actually brings us to the next point, which is one of the key things in Telly, which is really you have to adopt your audience's perspective. You have to put yourself in their shoes. You have to be able to think like them. Once again, the difference here, the sort of the conceptual difference in the Telly approach is that oftentimes the scientific educational approach is you come at this with thinking that I know the right thing here, as in me as an expert, an educated expert, I know the right way to look at this issue, and all I need to do is to convince the landowners. And if they follow my mental model, if they adopt my mental model, they'll do the right thing. That is so not the case. You have to appreciate that landowners' mental model of the situation is different than yours, but it's equally valid, and it is valid for them. And the idea is not to change that, but to find the common ground between their mental model and your mental model. That's what this is about, to understand them and to find that common ground. So to recognize that what's easy for you isn't easy for them. What's obvious to you is not obvious to them. What's important to you is not important to them. So climate change might be super important to you because you understand it and you know it, but it's not important to them. And trying to convince a landowner about something that's not important to them is actually breaking up that dialogue rather than establishing the relationship you need to bring them along. So what this means is the action that you propose to them has to make sense to them in their context, not just from the land perspective, not that it has to work for their land. Obviously, you guys know that, and you make customized recommendations based on what that forest needs at that time, but also from their situation perspective. Again, I think most of us individually are able to do this very well because you do keep the landowner's goals in mind and their resources in mind when you make recommendations. I think some of this fails when you're trying to talk to groups. That's when it becomes more, one size fits all. The reasons are obviously different. You have to be very focused on, the supports that they need. I keep saying the same thing because that's oftentimes there's this sense of like, here's the program we've created and landowners need to find a way to engage. And what we're saying is, no, you need to find a way to tailor your program to the landowners. This part is one of the very key things here. The main insight that I'd like to share with you, and the main takeaway here, is that getting someone to agree that something is a good thing to do doesn't mean that they're going to do it. There is a huge gap, and all the behavioral science literature has verified that there's a huge gap between someone thinking that they want to do this or they thinking it's the right thing to do and actually doing this. And you don't have to look at the behavioral science literature. You can look in your own lives. I mean, think of all the things that you've been meaning to get to, or that are good things to do, but you don't do them, right? So how is that how do you bridge that gap between, yes, this is a good thing, and actually doing it? The difference is emotion over here. And it's not an accident that emotion, motivation, and motion all have the same root. All these three words have the same root because it is the same driver. It's about what compels someone to go, and emotion is what drives our action. There is lots, and again, there's lots and lots of studies done that once you are committed to act, your brain, your rational thinking, your logic tells you what action to take, but it is an emotion that's going to actually get you to do an action. Otherwise, we'd all be sitting around all day without any passion. We would all be sitting around all day doing nothing. Okay. So your job is to get them to take action. And so you want to be very intentional and direct about what emotion is going to drive that action. And you want to evoke that emotion. So it has to be something, either it's the desire to get something that they passionately care about, not something that they should care about, not something that they care about somewhat, right? But something that they passionately care about, right? And that passionately care about enough that they will actually, fight inertia and do what they need to do. Or maybe it's something that they fear enough that they want to avoid. Or maybe it's a feel-good feeling, that a sense of satisfaction that they want enough, that they want. So really identifying what that emotion is and really playing to that in your messaging is really, really important. I'm going to show you a few examples, hopefully that will sort of gel these three ideas being tailor identify a target audience and tailor your message to them, adopt their perspective. So figure out what's important to them, what's top of mind for them, and then create a compelling message that builds on that. Okay. So my first example is actually not from this field at all. This is from the public health field, which is where social marketing as a discipline originated. So a lot of the classical examples are from that field. So this is what we call a generic message. This is a scientist's message. A scientist who developed this thought this was very, very motivating because it's a number and it's a powerful number and it's presented in a powerful way. Okay. What we find is that messages like these land up being reinforcing more than motivating. So if you already decided that you wanted to give up smoking cigarettes, then this kind of message works really well because it firms up your resolve. And I think this applies a lot to our landowner outreach. The kind of generic message that we do, the more informational messages that just spell out different benefits of things, they are attractive to landowners who are already doing the right thing, who already want to do the right thing. So those are the people who attend all your workshops. Those are the people who call you up frequently, that solicit your services a lot. So the people who are already in with you, much of what you're talking, much of how you're talking is designed to actually appeal to those people. Okay. How do you bring in new people? How do you convince someone who's not convinced by these generic messages? That's when you have to think of specific audience segments that you want to go for. And the example I'm going to show you is for a very difficult audience, and that's teenage boys, right? A lot of the smoking harm happens in those early years. A lot of kids take up smoking in those early years. And that message, that generic message that you're seeing, is not going to do anything to persuade a teenage boy because obviously they're never going to die or they're not thinking about their death anyway. And those 14 minutes don't seem to matter very much to them. Okay, so exposing vulnerability is not going to motivate teenage boys, and any of you who have nephews or children of that age will probably completely identify with that. So what do teenage boys care about? If you're not writing in sex in that chat box, then you are thinking it anyway. That's what they care about. And so let's try and relate our benefit to something that they do care about. Oops, and that led to, this message. So this is, from the scientist's perspective, true, but not important. It's a side effect of tobacco. The lungs are hurt, and yes, your blood flow to extremities is also decreased, and so it can make it harder for you, right? But to a teenage boy, this is the most important downside of smoking. And the research has shown that this kind of message is really important, so much so that for a while, Canada had said that every box of cigarettes should have, instead of the cigarette smoking is injurious to health, like what we have, Canadians had to say cigarette smoking can reduce sperm count or something like that. So they figured that that actually works. So let's translate this thinking into something that is more relevant to what you guys talk about. So let's say this is an example from Connecticut and Buffers for Beauty. It was a program done for, the target audience here specifically was wealthy suburban, sort of ex-urban, but mostly suburban landowners. And the idea was all of these landowners have streams in their, flowing through their backyards, and they wanted these people to plant riparian buffers and not have their mowed lawn going right up to the stream, to plant some nice riparian buffers and plant some natives over there so that the stream quality would be improved. And there'd be some filtration from the lawn chemicals. So yes, these people care about water quality. And you can always say, improve water quality. And you can at the meetings, they all nodded when they said, when we asked, is water quality important to you? Everybody said, yeah, it's really important to us. But they don't care enough about water quality to do something about it, right? What they do care about is having beautiful yards, right? And that's what that's something they care about enough, and it's personally enough, relevant enough to them to drive action. And so that's what we did with this. So the idea here was for this initiative to say, well, let's connect this to something that they care about, and they care about beautiful yards. And so let's offer these at the end of the workshops, let's offer these designs of how you can do riparian plantings that just make your stream look a lot prettier. Okay, so that's one example of how you can sell this. Now, obviously, this is very different for the same issue, which is riparian plantings. For a very different audience, you've got to have a very different approach, right? So here's another example of how in Kansas, for Kansas farmers, the same action here, riparian plantings, right? But a different emotional tug. This is a fair emotional tug, because farmers care about water quality, yes. They also care about soil erosion. But rather than just putting something down that says, plant riparian buffers to preserve the soil and water, these people went to the heart of it and they said, okay, what really is emotional for them here is that land is their livelihood. And so they went that route, and they evoked that emotion in a more tangible way for people to say, you know what, if you don't plant these riparian buffers, your livelihood is just going to wash away. Okay, so that's what I'm trying to get at, to really pinpoint what is going to drive action, and to make that via your visuals and your language to really bring that emotion to the front. That orients people. Then you can provide all the information and the rationale and the benefits and the arguments, but you need this emotional hook to be able to orient people to what you're saying. Okay. I will pause there and see if there's anything in the chat box, any questions.
No questions so far. I think in the interest of time, we probably are safe to keep rolling.
Okay. I'm not going to talk about the next two Telly principles. It's organized resources to support action. Take a minute to look at it. The only point I'll make is that landowner attention is a very, very precious commodity. So when you have it, do not squander it. Make sure you capitalize on it. Make sure if they call you, make sure that you are taking them the rest of the way. If you're losing a lot of people, then it's like trying to fill your trough with a leaky pipe, and it's going to take a whole lot longer. If you can just plug the leaks in the pipe and make sure nobody's falling off, you're going to get to your goal a lot quicker. And then finally, I'll just say that Telly has a different approach to doing evaluation, and I won't go into that right now. So to simplify some of this messaging stuff that I've talked about, when you talk to landowners, I've tried to sort of distill that into a few questions that you should ask yourself about that landowner. So it's almost like in advance of every meeting that you do with the landowner, you should have answers to these questions. So the first one is, what is a doable activity for this landowner? What is meaningful for them? Doable in that practically doable, based on their resources and their ability. Meaningful where it'll give them a sense of accomplishment. Okay, and then based on that, what is the right next step for him or her? Like we talked about that ladder, if you remember. Then what's going to motivate them the most? And then what emotion is going to drive their action? And I've been sort of belaboring that this whole time, that identify exactly the one motivating thing. There may be several arguments, there may be several benefits, but pinpoint the one thing that is most compelling for them and focus on that emotion. Okay. And then what are the barriers? How can you help them? right? Is time a barrier? Is money a barrier for them? Is competition a barrier for them? Are they hearing different things? Do they need to be convinced because somebody else is saying something different to them? Are they not believing you? Is lack of belief? Is lack of trust a barrier? Identify exactly what is the barrier, and then figure out what is the best way to follow up. What is the timeline? How long is it going to take them? And then what is the best way to follow up with them? Okay. And with that, let's try and sort of apply these 4 questions to a few types of landowners that you might be dealing with. Okay. I'll turn it over to Christopher.
So we have some case studies of imaginary landowners who are, based on some of the real types of landowners who came out to some of the town hall meetings and wood forums over the winter. And we're going to start by hearing a profile of these landowners, and you can consider the key questions on the right side of the screen, and then we'll take some time to consider responses to those, and that's when you can type responses into the chat box, while I'm reading the profile or during the discussion that follows. We're going to start with Jim and Nancy. They're landowners in their late 60s. And they've owned an 80-acre property that's dominated by oak hardwood forest for many years. They're enrolled in the state current use program, have a forest management plan, and they've worked with a forester on stewarding their property for some time. And in particular, they did everything they could to encourage the growth and development of the large canopy oaks on their property with an eye towards a harvest that could provide needed income as they ease into retirement. But unfortunately, the gypsy moth outbreak led to the death of most of the canopy trees on about half their property. And Jim and Nancy were dismayed by this turn of events, and they're unsure about how to proceed with parts of their land looking like what they've termed a fallout zone, and the oak timber is worth a fraction of its previous value. And after following their forester's advice for many years, they're angry about the situation in which they find themselves, and they feel that government agencies should have done more. And to make things worse, they're also now worried about their financial situation as a result of the stock market downturn and a possible recession associated with the coronavirus pandemic. Jim and Nancy are still open to management, but they're feeling shaken by recent events, and their neighbors have been encouraging them to let nature take its course in their woods.
All right, thank you, Christopher. So just following up on that, I put in the chat box that first question that you see there. So thinking about Jim and Nancy and maybe some landowners that you've worked with that might remind you of Jim and Nancy, what is a doable, meaningful activity for Jim and Nancy? What next step makes the most sense for them? So please take a moment and type into the chat box some of your thoughts. And we are going to go through the next questions. So if you have thoughts on some of those, you could jot those down on a piece of paper and be ready to, or type them in a note and be ready to share them in just a moment. So for now, please type into the chat box, what's a doable, meaningful activity for Jim and Nancy based on what you've heard from this landowner profile?
I'm wondering if any of you out there might be working with landowners like Jim and Nancy now.
Yeah, so we'll give folks a moment. Please type into the chat box something. And, a doable, meaningful activity, a first step, the next step could be something as simple as calling, as calling their forester. Maybe day to day they're busy thinking about being sequestered inside and how can they, meet up with their grandkids on Zoom if they don't know how to use Zoom. But maybe a doable, actionable step to get out of that inertia. Maybe it's something as simple as calling their forester to start having a plan. Yeah, I'm seeing some thoughts come into the chat box. Thanks for typing. Michael Leff suggested get professional advice on what financial ramifications would be now under these new circumstances. Really good suggestion. Thank you, Michael. Mark had a thought. Conduct a salvage harvest to improve the future composition of their forest. What is their legacy? So good question. Yeah. So see if you can conduct a salvage harvest. Carl suggests ask their forester for recommendations. Yeah. So those are doable, meaningful next steps for Jim and Nancy. Russ suggests update the management plan with the updated circumstances. Yeah. So it would be great if they could get to that point and update their plan. All right. We'll give folks another moment to, talk to other landowners. Thanks, Doug. Yeah, talk to other landowners in a similar situation. And maybe, Purnima had mentioned those steps and the supports. So maybe we can do something to support Jim and Nancy, reaching out and talking with other landowners that are in that similar situation. So really good thought. So please feel free to keep typing your thoughts into the chat box. I'm going to post the next question just as a reminder. So what benefit, threat, value would motivate them the most? What emotions are driving their actions in this situation? And while you're typing your answers to that second question, what benefit or threat would motivate them the most, or what emotion would drive their actions? I'll just read a couple more of the answers that have popped in. Joseph says, I would encourage a harvest to salvage their timber and delay the cut as long as possible to let the markets recover. Definitely a good consideration with a lot of uncertainty in the markets right now. Michael suggests consider a regeneration harvest to establish the next oak forest. Yeah, we hope that we can get the oak regeneration that we want, for sure. All right, so we'll let folks type in what's the emotional driver for Jim and Nancy, and what will motivate them to take these actions that you're suggesting. Doug already shared, he wrote sharing grief. So yeah, that might motivate them to reach out to other landowners. Michael shared risk of losing more money by inaction. Ooh, that's interesting. So that's sort of a fear one then, Michael. So risk of losing more money by inaction. Yeah, definitely a thought. Other thoughts, what are some emotional drivers that might encourage Jim and Nancy to take these steps that you are outlining or that you're thinking of? I'll give you another moment to type those in. Also, if you're feeling like you're running dry on those questions, there's the next question, which we're queuing up, which is what are the main barriers that they face and how can we reduce these barriers? Yes, Michael is clarifying fear and hope. So risk of losing money by inaction. So there's fear and hope involved in that. Yeah. What are the main barriers that they face? How can we reduce these barriers? So what are some barriers in the way for Jim and Nancy?
Mark had some good input about clarifying the legacy of Jim and Nancy and what they're going to leave for the next generation, and perhaps finding an opportunity to talk with them about that, as they don't have direct heirs, what they'd like to see happen with their land.
Yeah. And then we had a kind of a pair of comments kind of talking about actions and barriers. Doug suggested they could get professional advice to determine if the required number of trees can remain in order to satisfy PA 490. And Michael suggested, well, what if they had a past bad experience with professional advice? So I don't know, maybe they worked with a logger or with a previous forester that didn't quite get them the results they wanted. So that could be a barrier. Emma suggests the loss of options that they thought they had. So that might be a barrier if they don't have the options that they thought were available to them when they had their plan made before. So those could be some barriers that could make it seem more uncertain and overwhelming to try to take some of these actions.
Yeah, I'm looking at these people here, and we are thinking, because we are interacting with these folks in the context of forestry, we are thinking of them in that context of like their relationship to their land, which obviously you have to do. But one way to also understand your landowner is to step back from that and think of them in their entire situation as people, right? And when I think of them in this way, with so close to retirement, the one major thing that is on their minds right now has to be money and the money loss that they have. And so I would say that almost anything that improves their financial situation, they would be motivated to do. And almost anything that requires an outlay of capital with any uncertainty on their part, uncertainty of the return, they would be loath to do. So that's something to just, it's sort of like understanding what right now is mainly driving this landowner is actually part of understanding the landowner and being able to work with them. Like, what is the frame in which they're going to see all these decisions? Yeah, you could be in their situation. I mean, I can think of myself. I could be very environmentally conscious and very environmentally minded and really want to have my forest prosper. But at this point, given what has happened, if it required me to invest money, I probably wouldn't want to do it. So just understanding those kinds of barriers, I think, is important.
Yeah, thank you, Purnima. And we have some more good follow-up thoughts coming into the chat box as we're thinking about this audience and about these landowners. Doug suggested they might be talking to neighbors who own forest land. So hopefully that would be a good thing if we can help support that, but it could be a potential bad past experience as well. Another barrier Mark pointed out is the lack of the market to support a salvage harvest right now and the cost of the slash treatment to reduce fire hazards. So those are certainly considerations. In terms of that kind of big picture context, Terry commented, we have this problem frequently with tornado damage. Consult with a forester for a timber valuation and then consult with their CPA about claiming a casualty loss on farm taxes. So if you've just suffered damage to your property from a tornado, that would certainly be a barrier and a challenge and something that might make it feel difficult to take action. Doug suggests they could ask their consultant if he or she knows others who have suffered gypsy moth damage. And he says the time frame for action is immediately. So I should put that last question into the chat box. So Doug would want them to call him immediately to try to take some action in their woodlot. So Doug, you can put your number in the chat box. I'm just teasing. Joseph says, I think their biggest fear is losing future income. Sounds like they believe in forestry, but find themselves in a bad spot. Recommend that they do a select conservative cut to alleviate the present conditions. So doing something in the interim, and kind of keeping their options open silviculturally for the future. So definitely a good thought. So again, that fourth question there, what is the time frame for their action and what follow-up assistance is needed? So besides Doug giving them their phone number, and Doug is a service forester in Massachusetts, so this is his job to outreach to landowners. So what follow-up assistance is needed? I think Purnima had said it earlier, make sure if you have their time, call, make sure that you are taking advantage of that time. It's a hot commodity. So please feel free to type into the chat box for Jim and Nancy, what is the time frame for their action and what follow-up assistance is needed? What would you do if you were their service forester or consulting forester?
One of the things I'm thinking about is, what actions need to be taken that would be required before taking action, on the ground in their woods. If there's anything that needs to be done leading up to that.
Yeah, Michael just suggested you should see some action within a few weeks, and the consultant should recontact after a few weeks to help push past any obstacle, including inertia. So yeah, good suggestion, Michael. Greg says they don't feel like they have time to wait. So maybe they're feeling like they need to do something soon. So trying to push them to take action while it's fresh in their minds. All right. I think we can probably segue to our next case study. So we have another one for you. So setting aside Jim and Nancy, who are very important people, they actually, we have another couple here who you might know in some way, shape, or form, who also have a story to tell. So let's see how we relate to them. Christopher.
Now we're going to talk about Priya and Matt. They recently acquired a 20-acre property of oak pine woods for themselves and their children. And they recently moved into a new house they built along the public road on this property. It's within commuting distance of the city, but they often work remotely from home. Both members of the couple grew up in an urban area and they have little experience with forestry, although they like spending time outside and bird watching. Matt and Priya like the idea of their 4- and 8-year-old children exploring the property, and it's turned out to be a valuable place for family recreation and retreat during this extended period of social distancing that we're having. The focus on public health, however, has also heightened their concerns about illnesses that can be borne by ticks and mosquitoes. They have an older neighbor who's talked with them about the importance of thinning out the woods, but they're not sure where to start, and they're concerned about being able to find non-biased information. They're worried about being taken advantage of by a logger. And there are a number of deciduous trees on the hill behind their house that have yellow leaves. They're not looking healthy, but they're not sure what to do about them, and they're busy with their work and family priorities.
All right, thank you. So, and again, we have the notes in front of us for Priya and Matt. So, focusing on the action, what is a doable, meaningful activity for Priya and Matt? What is a practical next step for them, given these circumstances? What's the next step that you could see them taking? So Michael suggests that they contact their service forester. Barb suggests that they find somebody local, perhaps a state forester or service forester in Massachusetts. Michael says they should get recommendations for a consulting forester to assess their property and develop a forest management plan. Mark says they should establish a trail through the woods and conduct some hazard tree removal and thinning. Yeah, something you can do hopefully safely. They should come to my women's chainsaw safety workshop. Joseph says, I would recommend that they contact their state service forester for advice and get into a stewardship program soon. Definitely a good thought. Carl says, again, contact a service forester, join a forest owners association. Try Google. So yeah, in Massachusetts, we would definitely have opportunities to connect them. Oh, I guess assuming they were Massachusetts, I didn't say that exclusively. And Russ, again, says, look for a local service forester. So I think folks are in agreement that they should find a service forester. So as we're doing that, attend a coverts workshop or coverts workshop. Thank you. So I'm hearing call a forester, but also connect with other landowners through coverts or through a woodland owners association. So those are some good steps that they could take. But before they take those steps, what's going to motivate them to take that step of contacting a service forester or going to join their local woodland owner association or organization? What benefits or threats or values will motivate them to do that? What emotions will drive Priya and Matt to take these actions? So focusing on, JP says fear of triple E. So yeah, Eastern equine encephalitis, definitely an issue in parts of Southern New England. So that might be something that would motivate them. Doug earlier had said an initial assessment by a forester to check forest health, and in particular, look for areas like barberry that might favor tick populations. So in terms of that emotional motivation, ticks is the yuck emotion. Mark says getting their family into the woods safely. So that captures that as well. Michael says reduce chance of tick-borne illness by reducing good tick habitat. And Michael says love. Michael Leff says love for motivating them to get into the woods. Carl says concern about forest health, concern about human health. Definitely those are motivating factors. Yeah, and JP agrees. In reality, there are more real concerns about tick-borne illness at this time. Hopefully triple E won't get significantly worse. Doug says another motivating emotion is the desire to provide enjoyable experiences for themselves and their children. So that's a good emotional anchor. Russell says persuade a harvest to bring in more sunlight and reduce the mosquito population. So maybe that is something they could consider. And Christopher suggests it's an opportunity for shared family experiences. Yeah, so all these are good emotional hooks, kind of the stick and the carrot, or the positives and the negative, the hope and the fear. So now we've got the action that we want them to take, or a couple of actions we might want them to take. And we have a thought about what's the emotional driver, or what might be the emotional drivers. So then the next question, of course, is what are the main barriers that Priya and Matt face? How can we reduce these barriers? How can we reduce the barriers and help them to call their local woodland association or call their service forester? Michael Bartlett says lack of knowledge. So maybe they don't know what a forester is. Maybe they don't know what a service forester is. Maybe they think foresters are loggers. So that's a barrier for sure. Emma says lack of trust, fear of biased information. That definitely sounds like that would be a barrier for them if they're concerned about professional experiences that they have heard of or may have had in the past. So certainly that would be a barrier as well. And how can we reduce these barriers? How do you reduce the barrier of a lack of knowledge? Yeah, fear of Mark, that would be another barrier for sure. Yeah, how do we reduce these barriers? Get a logger to move in next door. I'll get them to get to know somebody. Leonora suggests limited time to devote to the subject. That would definitely be a barrier. Yeah, they're busy. They got 2 young kids. They might be homeschooling right now. So it's hard to think about calling a forester or joining another organization when your bandwidth is a little short at the moment. So yeah. So how do we overcome these barriers? I'm hearing some more barriers. Fear of making a mistake in their woods. That's an interesting one, Russell. So yeah, people might be afraid of making a mistake, and we'd want to help share that doing something is better than doing nothing. Rosa suggests not knowing where to start or what questions to ask or who to ask them of. So thank you, Barb, is starting to provide how do we reduce these barriers. So Barb suggested provide online outreach. So that's definitely a good place to start. I'll give a quick plug to Barb, one of our Forest Stewards Guild members in West Virginia, and she's supporting the Women Owning Woodlands organization there. And she's got a nice Facebook group for women woodland owners in West Virginia. So online outreach. So for other folks out there, share what are some other ways to reduce these barriers? You know, the fear, the lack of trust, the fear of making a mistake. What are some ways that we can help reduce these barriers for Priya and Matt? And if you think you're running dry on that, you can also think about the 4th question, the timeline for action. Either way, let's see if, so we have a lot of barriers, but we don't have a lot of ideas coming in on how to overcome those barriers. Well, we don't have to have all the answers on this webinar. Feel free to type them into the chat box if you think of it. But for now, we'll go to our, so Russell had a good step for them to take. Get them in contact with some neighbors that have done work in the woods. Really nice idea. That sounds excellent. So yeah, that's something that they can do to help overcome, that we can do to help them overcome that barrier. Excellent. Oh, and JP has another one. Connect them through the retailers they patronize, such as REI, or magazines they read, such as Architectural Digest. Oh, yeah, very interesting. So kind of like Purnama's example from earlier about smoking, you know, try to reach them in places and with messages that they would want to pay attention to. Lisa's, oh, good one. Bring in a wildlife specialist to consult too. Thank you. That is a very important point. And as much as we love talking forestry, wildlife is a major motivator, especially with Priya and Matt, and everybody we know who's like them. Michael says, walk their woods with them and chat. That's a really great fundamental way to help people overcome these barriers of fear. Oh, Barb pointed out also home garden centers, you know, is another good place to try to reach people. Yeah, especially these days. If you're selling chickens, like here, go call a service forester while you're at it. Chickens and what's the other one? Sourdough starters and planting your home garden during the pandemic. So great places to reach people, especially like Priya and Matt, who want to get to know their land better. All right. So last question for everybody, time frame. What is the time frame for their action and what follow-up assistance is needed? So given all that they have on their plate, Priya and Matt, how quickly should they act? What would be reasonable? If you were Priya and Matt, if you know people like them, what would be a reasonable time frame for them to take action, to take these actions that we were suggesting, whether calling a service forester or joining a woodland owner association or getting to meet a neighbor and walk in their woods with them? What would be a good time frame for action? And how do we help make sure that they do that? Michael Leff says, first season on their new property. While it's so exciting and full of promise. Good point. So springtime, we're all excited about the greenery that we're seeing. Doug says immediately. All right, Doug is going to call Priya and Matt as soon as this webinar is done. Thank you, Doug. All right. So really good thoughts on time frame. Okay, Russell says a few weeks. Follow up with an email or a phone call. Good thought. And the weather will be getting nicer in the next few weeks. Oh, Barb says before the kids' summer sporting event. Good point. Yeah, very good point. And again, that's understanding the whole person, understanding where they're coming from. So I'll let folks keep typing in the chat box, but I do want to turn it back to Purnima because we are just a few minutes before the top of the hour and Purnima had a few wrap-up thoughts for us. So thanks everybody for your contributions, and here's Purnima.
Okay, wrap up thoughts, really wrapping up. So here's just reviewing these principles for you. Just be clear about what you want landowners to do, not just in the big picture, but the next step for them. So people need to be told what to do instead of saying, well, here's a brochure on active management. Don't leave any meeting without the next step already figured out. So when should I call you? What will be your next step? Just provide some guidance. It's not to say you're going to straight lace people and say, no, you have to do this. It's a back and forth. Let you figure out with them what the next step is, but try and establish that next step, because if you don't, then it's going to fall off that ladder. That ladder that we talk, people just fall off of it. Tailor your program for the specific audience. We talked a lot about that. Really try to see the problem from their perspective. Understand what is the barrier for them. Understand what is, what's simple for you. Oh, fill out an NRCS form might be really, really difficult for them to do. Oftentimes, in the context of pre and mat also, there's a lot of hesitation, but people don't know what forestry is about. And that helping people get past that is going to be really important. Find what's really motivating them right now and use that in your messaging. That's the compelling reason to act. Organize your resources to support action, and also evaluate. Make sure that what you're doing is making sense to the landowner. Keep checking in with them. Listen as much as you speak is another way to put it. And I think that's it from me. I think I will turn it back to Amanda. Please go to our website. You see the link below. Call me, email me if you, no, don't call me, email me if you have any questions or you want any additional materials. We actually have most of our materials on our website, but we also have other information if you should want it. So, and if you want us to work with you, call me for that also. And I will say thank you very much to Amanda and Christopher for inviting me to do this and for participating and doing half of it. So
yeah, and thank you, Purnima. I learn something every time we get to work together, so this is really enjoyable. I also want to thank all of our participants for engaging and really putting your thought into this. As we, oh, Doug says Happy Earth Day. Thank you, Doug. That was an excellent reminder.
To everyone.
Happy Earth Day, everybody.
Yeah.
Yeah, so this is great. So thanks for folks that are following this Oak Resiliency project. We are working on a website where we can archive this webinar recording and some other resources from the Yankee SAF meeting and other conversations we're having around Oak Resiliency. For folks coming from outside New England and that were joining us today, thank you. We're really glad to have you and have your perspectives in here. Please feel free to follow up with Christopher or Purnima or myself with your additional thoughts or questions. And let us know how we can help you engage more efficiently and effectively with landowners in your area. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you, guys. Bye-bye.
Thanks.